Satellite radio. It is exactly what it sounds like. It's radio brought to you by satellites. Typically to your car. How many of you have bought a new car that came with one of these? Sirius XM is the one and only provider, and they have deals in place with every major automaker. If you're buying a new car in the US, no matter what make or model, you can probably get it with a satellite radio. In order to use it, you have to keep up with the monthly subscription costs, and in my eyes, there's two main reasons why you might want to do it. Compared to traditional radio, there's fewer commercials and more choices. Since they make most of their money from subscriptions rather than ads, 91% compared to 3%, they're able to offer all of these commercial-free music stations, which can be attractive considering the excessive amount of commercials that you may encounter on regular radio stations. And I say more choices because there is quite a bit of content that you won't get otherwise. I'm talking about certain genres of music, sports broadcasts, Howard Stern, and other talk shows. I'm sure that you can name other benefits or drawbacks, but that's my overview. If their specific content or lack of commercials is attractive to you, you might like Sirius XM. Despite being a large, well-known company that's arguably successful with something to offer, I am amazed that they still exist. They have had so many close calls. Sirius XM is the result of combining two struggling companies named Sirius and XM. Today, I want to focus on these two, mostly before that merger, highlighting their struggles, how they've competed with each other, what has made them different, and what ultimately motivated them to come together. The first major difference is in their formation. Sirius was always pursuing satellite radio, whereas XM initially intended to be more involved in satellite telephone services. Sirius was started by Robert Briskman, who was an engineer that had previously worked at NASA and Geostar. He had created this technology that was able to broadcast radio signals using satellites, so he started this company that would hopefully utilize that technology to provide a satellite radio service. It was initially called Satellite CD Radio, but the name was changed to Sirius in 1999. Sirius, by the way, is the name of the brightest star in the sky. It's part of a dog constellation, which would explain this dog logo that they've used. Now, XM was started for very different reasons. It was in 1988 when 8 different companies came together to form the AMSC, the American Mobile Satellite Corporation. Their main intention was to make telephones that operated using satellite technology. In 1995, they put out their first phone, but it was considered a pretty big failure. It was too expensive, and the mobile phone industry was changing, so it was looking like this was not a promising direction. They were thought to be coming close to bankruptcy, and it took a $225 million line of credit to save them, but fortunately, they had started a satellite radio division back in 1992. That would soon become an important part of their business. In 1998, they changed the name of that radio segment to XM Satellite Radio, and the next year they spun it off into its own company. But the AMSC would retain majority ownership. You know, I'm gonna go ahead and add the name change to this because they have both become very recognizable names. Both of these companies started with different names. The name XM was adapted in 1998, and the name Sirius came a year later. A big part of this early on, and the reason why these two were the only names in satellite radio, has to do with their ability to obtain a license from the FCC. In order to legally do what they wanted to do, they needed to possess a license to broadcast satellite radio signals, and the FCC only gave out 2 of them. The circumstances get complex, but they were both bought in 1997. Sirius came in first and paid $83 million for it, and XM came in a year later paying $90 million for theirs. So at this point, we have 2 companies with only each other to compete with, but they were trying to provide a service that takes so much time and money to get started. They had to have these satellites built and launched into orbit. XM was building a 2-satellite network, whereas Sirius had 3, which I guess meant XM had to use more of these things called repeaters on the ground to help out the signal in some areas. I believe in the end resulting in a similar quality to the users. I don't know exactly how it all works, but it was expensive. Both of them spent well over $1 billion before they ever had a single customer. summer. Leading me to my next comparison, their launch date, which I know may sound trivial, but it ended up being significant because whoever is available on the market first is going to take a lead. See, for both of them, their launch date was pushed back, one of them far more than the other. XM planned to do it on the unfortunate date of September 12th, 2001, which for obvious reasons was pushed back, but only by 2 weeks. On September 25th of that year, they officially launched their service to a limited market, and by November, it was going out to the entire country. I wouldn't call that ideal, but things went much worse over at Sirius. Back in 1998, they said that they expected to launch things toward the end of 2000, which would have given them almost a year lead ahead of XM, but they had issues internally that forced them to keep pushing it back until they finally launched it for a limited market in February of 2002, and not widely available until July of that year, effectively giving XM a considerable lead. Before Sirius was ever even on the market, XM had over 30,000 subscribers and was named Product of the Year by Fortune. All of those struggles helped put Sirius near bankruptcy shortly after their launch. They were forced to raise money by converting hundreds of millions of dollars of debt into common stock, kind of a desperation move which made their shares outstanding almost 10 times higher. More shares meant each one was worth less, which caused their stock price to drop to well under $1 by the end of 2002. Alright, since they were both finally providing an actual service, it would make sense to compare their subscribers. In their final separate year, it was still noticeably higher for XM, though Sirius was starting to catch up. When we look at the graph over that time, XM always seems to be about a year ahead, don't they? Possibly further showing how Sirius was hurt by those delays. A good thing to go along with this would be revenue, because they do make most of their revenue from these subscriptions. And as we would expect, it was higher for XM all the way through their final year apart, but here's what I want to point out. We don't often see a graph like this, because they were both operating their companies for years without, the actual sales part of the business. The way that they were able to pull that off was very similar between the two, just taking out loans, selling off parts of the company, commonly through separate rounds of public stock offerings, similar to what I mentioned before. The graph that I find the most interesting is their net income, or in this case, their net loss graph. Before they were providing a service, it was obviously negative, because there was no revenue to offset the expenses. But you would hope that after you get the service going, it would start to get better. Well, in this case, things just got worse, because it was costly to run this service. This'll help show it. Here are a few ways that they competed with each other. Deals with the car makers. These were vital. In the beginning of this video, I talked about how the service is now available in practically any new car, but at this time, they were competing against each other to attract different makers, so they would include the radios and services in their new cars. The big ones for Sirius were Chrysler, Ford, and BMW, which made up 40% of all car sales. For XM, it was Honda, but mainly GM. GM actually owned a significant stake in the company, which could be part of the reason that XM always had a bigger focus on cars. At one point, half of all of their new subscribers were coming from people who got them pre-installed when they bought their new GM cars, while for Sirius, only about a quarter of the new subscriptions came from any of their car partners. Sports. In 2003, Sirius made multi-year, multi-million-dollar deals with the NFL and the NHL to secure exclusive satellite radio broadcasting rights to all of their games. In 2004, XM responded strong when they paid $650 million to exclusively broadcast all of the MLB games over their channels for the next 11 years. Also, we have DJs. XM signed a contract with Opie and Anthony in 2004, but I think anyone would agree that the most significant one was when Sirius made a deal with Howard Stern. It was an unprecedented radio contract where they would pay something like $500 million for him to move his show exclusively to their service for the next 5 years. And they were willing to pay that much because Howard Stern had a very large, very dedicated following. When surveyed, about 30% of them said that they would pay that subscription price so they can continue listening to him. Do you see how much money that they were forced to pay to have a service that subscribers thought was worth paying for? Because of these excessive expenses, both Sirius and XM believe that satellite radio could not continually exist with two companies competing for market share. Basically saying the market could not stand to be fragmented at all. And just looking at all of this, I'd say they may have had a point. Even with the level of growth that they were experiencing, nothing good was happening financially. Then once it's not new anymore, most people already have their their subscriptions if they were going to get them, things would just get worse. It was already bad and not thought to be moving in a great direction. But if the two were to come together, they'd be able to combine their assets, cut down on those costs, and stop competing with each other. I guess sort of like when you can't afford to live on your own, so you go out and find a roommate. The merger was controversial too. It took well over a year to be approved. It had to go through the Department of Justice and the FCC. The big concern was that it would create a monopoly as far as satellite radio, which, yeah, of course, is hard to argue, but then the companies made the point that the real concern should be the entire radio industry. Since they would still be competing with terrestrial radio and internet radio, they felt that they really wouldn't have a monopoly. Well, in 2008, they got all the approvals that they needed and the merger happened. It formed a combined company called Sirius XM with 19 million subscribers. My guess is that neither of these companies and satellite radio in general would not exist today otherwise. On top of everything that was already going on, just months following the merger in 2008, the economy took a turn, which was bad on a few levels. Satellite radio is not exactly a necessity that people would continue to pay for when money is low, and the auto industry that they were so closely tied to was among the most affected. New car sales were down, and they had always relied on those sales to drive new subscriptions. 2009 was actually the first year either of them had seen a net loss in subscriptions. Considering the fact that even together they barely survived it, this company Liberty Media had to come in with a $530 million investment, buying 40% of the company. Separately, I can't imagine that they would have made it. Those were bad times for SiriusXM, and really, financially speaking, it was always bad times for these two, but after that, things got considerably better. Over the last decade, they've almost doubled their number of subscribers, their revenue has been consistently moving in the right direction, and as of 2010, they've been turning a profit every year. Their increased involvement in the recovering auto industry has been big, that $500 million investment was big, and just operating together over the past decade has been huge. Let me know in the comments, what has been your experience with satellite radio? They've grown to almost 35 million subscribers, so if you're one of those, when did you first subscribe and what made you do it? Also, what do you see for the future? There's so many options beyond radio to entertain you in your car today. Podcasts and Spotify are actually the ones that I prefer to use, so how will that affect them? They have already gotten involved in streaming, from the Sirius XM app and Pandora. They bought them for $3.5 billion in 2018, so are they making the right moves? And any other thoughts you have about Sirius, XM, or SiriusXM, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.